As you know, the On Farm podcast is brought to you by the team at Scene&HerdPR and Marketing, and I just wanted to remind you about a new initiative that's happening here called On Record. On Record is a project to preserve voices, stories and memories for the future with your very own audio recording. So we're recording memories of rural life. We're travelling around Scotland, working with families and organisations to capture precious voices of family members or staff members or long-serving office bearers, to preserve those for posterity and sometimes for historical value. So if you think this project is something that you'd like to be involved in, and maybe you have a grandparent or a parent that you'd like to capture on audio while you can, please do get in touch. You can find out more at onrecordmemories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the On Farm podcast. It's Anna here with you this week, and a topic that, as will become clear, is quite close to my heart. So this week we welcome Gillespie Macandrew, not just as our long-term and loyal sponsors, but also as our contributors for this episode, because as you will hear, getting some of their legal expertise on this topic. So without further ado, I shall let them introduce themselves and go into a bit more detail on the topic of fly tipping, or in this case extreme fly tipping, and what we can all do about it.
Hi, my name's Connor McConnell. I am a senior solicitor in Gillespie Macandrew's dispute resolution team.
Hi, I am Elaine Kennedy-Walton. I am an associate solicitor in Gillespie Macandrew's land and rural business team.
Now, I've told this little anecdote in kind of a light-hearted way in the past, but actually, based on what we're about to talk about, it shouldn't be lighthearted at all. But I fed my daughter's pony this morning, and he gets these pony nuts that I have to soak in water. And the pony nuts live inside an old freezer, which is turned on its side. So I lift the lid up, kind of turned it on its side like a chest freezer. Now, we came upon this chest freezer because somebody dumped it in our farm gateway. And my husband said, I'm going to have to find something to do with this. I can't leave it there because I can't get the sprayer into the field. And on that one occasion, I said, well, actually, I could find a use for this freezer. But this is not a light-hearted conversation, because this is not the only time that this has happened to us. It's probably that happened. I've lived here for 13 years, and we must have had stuff dumped in gateways, at the side of fields, at least 5 or 6 times during that period. And that's what we're talking about today, aren't we? We're talking about fly tipping and dumping. And actually, we're going to talk about something which was a new phrase for me, which is extreme fly tipping. And we'll come on to that in a minute. But this is a real issue, isn't it? You know, farmers and landowners across the whole of Scotland are finding things that they don't want and that don't belong to them, and that are effectively somebody else's rubbish dumped in places that they then have to deal with. Connor, I'll maybe come to you first. Is this something that you deal with a lot in your day-to-day work?
It certainly arises quite often. It's interesting. You've given an anecdote there, Anna. It's very much the same for myself. You see this all over, particularly the central belt. I've found in Edinburgh. I live just outside of city centre in Edinburgh itself, and funnily enough, more recently I've seen quite an uptake in fly tipping in the area, and certainly through the help that we give to some of our rural clients, we find that this is an issue that does relatively often come up, whether it's a abandoned fridge freezer or black bin bags or the contents of a refurbished kitchen or something like that, which has been dumped on their property. And of course, the first question that comes up is, what do I do now?
Yes, and that's exactly the question that came up when it happened to us. Now, I know, Elaine, when it first happened to us, I had not long left a job at NFU Scotland, so I knew about the Dumb Dumpers helpline, which I phoned, and actually, fantastically, within 2 hours, somebody had come and taken everything away. But that helpline isn't available anymore. So I suppose the first question, I've got so many questions for you, but the first question is, if you are a victim of this and you find something, what any of the examples Connor's given, or even more extreme examples, which we'll come on to later, what is the first thing we need to do?
Anna, I sympathise with you having repeat offences of fly tipping on your farm. It is a pattern that we have noticed, and unfortunately it's very difficult to monitor in a rural area for farmers and for landowners equally, because it's not practical to put up CCTV in those locations and take some of the preventative measures that are easier to organise in more in city centres, etc. Your first port of call ought to be the local authority. It does also depend on the type of rubbish it is, and whether if it looks like it's criminal in any way, then the police should also be informed.
Do you happen to know if we need to contact the local authority? Is that information quite easy to come by? Is there a website that where we can just go in and get that information, or are they making it challenging for us? Are they just giving us another job to do?
I've not checked all of the local authority websites, because clearly there's quite a number across Scotland, but the ones that I have been on most recently do have a page that supports and gives sort of advice on fly tipping and what can be done about it and what their role is. Some of the local authorities even offer some grant schemes. Falkirk, for example, they offer some funding to help offset the costs of cleaning up, because there is a financial cost here across Scotland. There's 60,000 incidents have been reported over the last year, and the costs are estimated to be in the region of £10 million. So it's not insignificant.
Oh, absolutely. And I suppose we've been lucky. What we've found has been relatively easy to clear up. There's not been anything that's been hazardous or toxic. I gained some horse feed storage out of it, but again, it's not to be flippant. It still took time. We needed to get the forklift bucket out. We needed to fill it up. Then actually, I think we probably did need to hire a skip to get rid of it. And this is all time that farmers don't have, and it's just a lack of understanding also that farmers need to get on with the job and get on with the work. And if there's fridge freezers blocking the gateway, you can't always do that. Now, I suppose that the list is endless of things that we could find dumped in the countryside, and people listening have probably found all sorts of things. And I know also that there have been quite a few videos on social media of farmers confronting people, taking videos to try and prove what's happening. And what we were keen to talk about today is something that I know that Gillespie Macandrew have recently written an article about, which is becoming more prevalent, and that's what's called extreme fly tipping. Connor, can you give us a bit of a background as to what exactly extreme fly tipping is?
Yes, so I suppose when we talk about extreme fly tipping, what we're meaning here is above and beyond the examples that we gave earlier, so your black bin bags or your fridge freezer or otherwise. We're talking perhaps mostly cars or caravans, something which might not be so obviously abandoned. There might be that element of doubt as to whether or not someone is intended to come back for this. That'll often be where you see the likes of cars and caravans coming into it. Now, the issue there, or I suppose that the starting point is actually that it's much in the same way as any other fly tipping. It starts off as the starting premise has to be that if it's on your property, you're the one that unfortunately has to bear the burden of getting rid of it. Where it's different, and it goes over and above your regular fly tipping, as it were, is that if it turns out the property isn't abandoned, you risk your own liability for taking steps to get rid of it.
So kind of not a black and white situation then. And I suppose by not abandoned, do you mean perhaps that there could be a car that somebody's effectively living inside, or still, or effectively they've decided to park it there but haven't actually abandoned it?
It will always come down to the facts of the matter in any given set of circumstances, whether or not by law a piece of property is deemed abandoned or not. You would expect, or at least possibly anticipate, that in a scenario where it's a car or a caravan, there will be doubts over whether or not it has simply been left and someone is intending to come back for it for whatever reason it may have been left there in the first place, or that, as it might be suspected, it has simply been abandoned. So in that scenario, the risk lies in you removing the item in question, and then someone coming back and saying you have unlawfully got rid of something that belongs to me. In that scenario, there is a statutory obligation on a person to report the matter to the local authority and to the police. That is the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982. What should result from that is that the police should then, within, I believe, 2 months, provide you with a direction in terms of what you should do with the item. They may be able to give that direction earlier than 2 months, but you are obliged during that time to take reasonable care of the item. That's the law. In practice, are the police going to provide you with directions within that 2 month window or at all? I think we can accept that with the way things currently are, resources are tight, and that might not be the case. So that leaves the landowner with the question, what do I do in this situation? The belt and braces approach in that scenario is that you go to court and you ask the local sheriff court for an order which effectively sanctions the removal of the item in question. In that instance, you've then got the protection of the sheriff court order. Should anyone come out the woodwork sometime later and say, well, hold on, that wasn't abandoned or a fly-tipped caravan or car, it was mine and I was coming back to it, you're protected at that point. And that would always be our advice in that instance when you're dealing with something which is less obviously fly-tipped or abandoned property.
But presumably that would incur you a cost, would it, to go through that process?
Unfortunately, it would, yes. And again, that comes back to the very unsatisfactory initial point, which is that if items are dumped on private land, it's that private landowner who ultimately has to, at present at least, bear the cost of taking that forward and remedying the situation.
My non-legal background would have led me to assume that actually we'd be more likely to be talking time frame. So I would have assumed that somebody dumps a car on my land and that actually a certain time must pass, and after that time period has passed, then the assumption can be that that vehicle has been abandoned. But from what you're saying, that's my assumption is not relevant or correct at all. It's not based on that. It's based on effectively having to go through the proper processes to ensure that you're not disposing of something that somebody considers to still belong to them.
It's not based on a timescale, but you're right in saying that it's a relevant factor. So
Right.
when the court has to consider whether or not an item has been abandoned, how long it's been there will absolutely play a part in that, particularly when it's something you would expect wouldn't be left for a sustained period of time, like a car or a caravan, say. So that would absolutely play a part in it. You would like to think that in these circumstances, if given the costs involved in raising proceedings, you would likely expect that someone would give time for something to be removed before taking that next step. And so I would expect that in those circumstances, when you got to the point of raising court proceedings, a court would be sympathetic, taking at face value what appears to be abandoned property.
And during that passage of time, there are some steps that you can take to help build your case, so that by the time you go to court, you have a very persuasive, robust case that the court are going to agree with. So, for example, you could evidence it with photographs. You could put a notice on the car asking for it to be removed, pointing out that it's on private land, for example. And by doing that, you're building the strongest possible case that you can while you're waiting for the remote possibility that is going to be picked up by the keeper or the owner.
Another question's just occurred to me, actually. But what would you do if it was, farms are big places. You could have a car dumped in an area that's, let's face it, is not going to get in your way, that you could effectively ignore. But you could also have a car or a caravan or something large dumped in a place where actually it can't stay there because you need access to a farm building or to a field. If it was that sort of scenario, Elaine, what would you do then? Because obviously that brings more of a sense of an urgency to having to deal with it.
I think in those circumstances, it would not be unreasonable to tow the car to a close road. Would you agree with that, Connor?
The main thing in terms of the legislation is that you take reasonable care of the item until such time as you've got your direction to do elsewise with it. So I agree that towing it out of the way of any immediate access route or otherwise would, and it would depend on the circumstances in any given situation, but generally speaking would perhaps be okay. It may very well be that it must remain on your property, though, in that scenario, perhaps, given that once it's off your property, it's no longer your responsibility. And the point being that we said earlier on was that in that scenario, you run the risk that if anything were to happen to it once it's off your land, and you have put it in that position, you might then be liable for that.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Elaine, I have to say, when I first read the article that Gillespie Macandrew had published about this issue, I was, I suppose, quite surprised that it was a big issue, and the article very clearly says that these vehicles, it's becoming an increasing problem. Do you have a handle on why that might be? Because certainly it's not something I've experienced firsthand, and we can all expect that it would probably happen once in a while, but for it to increase is a bit worrying.
It is a worrying trend, and this article was as a result of a client-led query on this, because it had happened to them on a number of occasions, and we were reiterating the same advice as we've discussed today. So, I mean, the reasons for that, a lot of times it's happening in remote locations, so perhaps there's a logistical problem with these larger items being disposed of. It can be quite expensive to do that, so there's probably economic reasons for that. Also, potential barriers to, and this speaks to general fly tipping as well, potential barriers. Is it easy now to recycle these things? Is it easy to get access to recycling centres? Is there perhaps payments being levied? Is there set hours only that people can go in to these recycling centres? There has been changes as a result of COVID, and I think in some areas the changes have meant that it is less easy for people to get in and to recycle their waste. I think also people are still staycationing, so perhaps they are going to these places with caravans or with cars. Something happens and they break down and they can't be bothered fixing them, unfortunately.
Yeah, very good point, actually. And I'd forgotten until you mentioned it just now, but I'm worried actually that we might see an increased incidence, because there was until recently a recycling centre probably about 4 miles down the road from us. And I read on social media that it is imminently closing because of council budget cuts. And so people will have to go further to get rid of their waste. And many people, unfortunately, may decide that they can't be bothered to do that. And I'm also, and I think I've always been astonished at the fact that it's the landowner's responsibility to pay for this. I mean, that would require a fundamental change, I suppose, in the law. Do you think that's coming, or do you think it will always be the landowner's responsibility to foot the bill for this?
The government are looking to help landowners in this respect. There is a bill called the Circular Economy Bill, which is making its way through Parliament at the moment. And the idea behind that is that it's going to help reduce waste, and there's going to be a new penalty regime to address littering from vehicles as part of that, and to make it easier to have vehicles seized which have been involved in waste crimes. That clearly is going to take a little bit of time. They have also increased the penalties.
I'm not sure on what is as against England, but the figure now is, I believe, £500, which is more than doubled what it was as of last year. Of course, that requires the person who has actually done the fly tipping to be caught. On that point, and Elaine had mentioned it earlier on about reporting anything to the local authority and to the police, I tend to find that the response you often get as well, it's in a rural area, the fly tipping has now happened. Is there any real point in reporting this to the police now? Is anything going to actually happen? And we have to be honest and say that in these circumstances, it can be difficult for anyone to be caught after the fact. However, I would still always encourage people to get in contact with the police, if for no other reason than to report for the purposes of starting a pattern. It may be that this provides the police with information as to where people are regularly going to fly tip. Alternatively, if at some point someone is caught in the act, as it were, they may be able to identify it in relation to previous similar occasions. So it can be useful, and so the advice would always still be to report it in each individual time it's happened, to report it in each scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the questions that's always in my mind is the balance between wanting to stop this happening and wanting to prosecute the people who are doing it, but also having personal safety in mind. And I know certainly we have a friend who caught some people in dumping on his land, and he stuck around and took quite extensive video footage of this happening. So he had video images of the perpetrators and the vehicle that they were in. And my question, now that I'm lucky enough to have two lawyers in front of me, my question to you, I suppose, is that legitimate? Are we allowed to do that? Personal safety aside, I think if I was him, I might have questioned how safe that was if he was on his own. And I think there were two perpetrators. So that might not be a sensible thing to do from a personal safety perspective. But if we can do it safely, are we allowed to do that? And does that video content help as evidence?
I'm not aware of anything that would stop you from being able to video anyone in that set of circumstances. And as you say, in terms of evidence, that's as good as anything else, I suppose, far better than what you would otherwise expect. So safety point aside, as you said, the fact that your friend has been able to has been on site and been able to take that would be far more than a lot of people will get in similar circumstances.
Yeah, I was worried about his safety, but I think actually, if you can do it safely, you want as much information as you can. I mean, one of the idiots who dumped stuff on our side of our field had left an Amazon box which still had a name and a full address on it. So I didn't go and knock on their door, but at least we were able to work out who it was and where it had come from.
That's certainly helpful to be able to identify who has dumped the waste. But obviously, if there's a chance that it's that the waste is hazardous or unhygienic in any way, we wouldn't be recommending that anybody would be searching through the waste if possible.
No, absolutely. And I think it's common sense, isn't it, to think about safety first, whether it's touching something dangerous or confronting people who might be dangerous. I think we do need to be careful. But I think this whole thing actually generates quite a lot of anger, I think, amongst the farming community, because it just shows, I mean, I'm straying off, legal questions here, but it shows a complete lack of respect for the people who are out there doing their best to grow our food. And instead their land is being used as a dumping ground. I worry that people will be a little too confrontational if they do find somebody, but at the same time, keeping your distance and having a video, your phone set for video is probably a very good idea. So do you think this problem is just going to increase then? And is there anything we can do to try and stop that?
In terms of steps that you can take to mitigate against the risk of fly tipping, perhaps the most obvious one is putting up some form of barrier or obstruction to stop what is often vehicles coming in for the purposes of dumping large amounts of waste. Perhaps the kind of classic example of a rural dirt track where you get to the end of it, you get to a dead end, and lo and behold, you're met with a bit of a rubbish tip. You do see, in fact, close to where I live, someone's taken this measure of putting up concrete barriers to stop vehicles going into what is otherwise a gap in a brick wall that's been used recently as a fly tipping area. I think people are sometimes reluctant to do that, and with good reason. We have right to roam legislation in Scotland. We have a system of law relating to when neighbouring owners can use access tracks or otherwise take access over your property, and you cannot infringe on those rights. So you can't put an obstruction in place that stops people from lawfully exercising their public or private law rights. That's not the same as saying you cannot put up any form of obstruction at all for the purposes of stopping fly tipping. It just has to be one which doesn't limit another person's lawful usage. So we would always advise that in those circumstances, if you are finding that you have land which is being used constantly and nothing is stopping that, take advice on what options might be available to you to try and mitigate against that without straying from the law yourself in terms of anyone else's access rights.
Oh, but I suppose most people listening, if not all people listening, will know this, but the right of responsible access does not extend to motor vehicles. So actually, as long as you are not preventing people from exercising responsible access on foot or on a horse or whatever, then that's okay.
That's correct. The one slight caveat is that in relation to access rights, private access rights, what we call servitudes, those are in favour of neighbouring owners, effectively. If those exist in relation to your land, they might relate to vehicular access as well.
For those specific people.
Yes, so yes. You've got a neighbour who takes access to the main road through your field, and they're entitled to do that by way of their car. You would be in breach of that if you were to put something in place which stops all vehicles, whether that person making use of that right or someone coming on to fly tip. So therein lies the reason to get legal advice before putting that in place. You're of course absolutely right in relation to the right to roam side of things, and indeed I'd mentioned earlier on the steps that some of my neighbours have taken, which amounted to just putting a cement barricade in place, which people can easily get over on foot, but stops any cars from coming onto what is otherwise just a bare bit of ground.
Elaine, this may be asking for your opinion rather than for your legal expertise, but if you're happy to share it, this article, Gillespie Macandrew article, talked about an increase. Do you think we're still facing that increase? Is there anything else that we can do to try and mitigate some of this in some way?
Unfortunately, I can't see that this is going to be a problem that will simply disappear, because the types of people who carry out these actions are not going to be deterred by increased fines, in my view. Yes, it helps, and probably it helps the people who have been victims, and landowners are victims in these circumstances. It probably gives them a little bit more peace of mind. But are the fines enough? Do we need harsher penalties? I would say yes, in my view.
So actually, this brings me on perhaps to maybe we're talking about a bit of lobbying here. You know, I know that you operate the NFU Scotland helpline, which is a helpline that members of NFUS can call if they've got a legal issue or question to ask. Obviously, this issue has cropped up there many times. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. But actually, yeah, I wonder if this is if I should throw this back to NFU Scotland and say there needs to be a greater lobbying going on to try and increase the penalties, because ultimately this crime needs to become as off-putting as possible for the criminals. Otherwise, they'll just keep doing it.
Particularly where it involves landowners going to court, because going to court is not cheap, and we would usually say that it should be a last resort. But in these circumstances, we are advising that a belt and braces approach would be best, and that clients should be taking people to court. But at the moment, the way the legislation is, they don't have a way to recoup their costs fully, because even if you're successful in obtaining expenses at court, it tends not to cover the full amount of your legal costs, unfortunately.
From a moral perspective rather than a legal perspective, that's just madness, isn't it? But I suppose the argument is, well, who should pay for it? If it's not the landowner, who should pay for it? And it's probably not likely to be the perpetrator.
There is another potential complication with cars, and more frequently caravans, in that if someone is potentially living in a car or a caravan, it really does up the ante from a point of view of potential eviction.
Yeah, the general rule is that you cannot remove someone from occupation without a court order sanctioning that. There are caveats to that, but in line with the kind of tone that we've taken so far here, the belt and braces approach is that you get that court sanction to remove someone. So again, that involves cost to the landowner. The timescales are typically far quicker than you might otherwise expect in court proceedings, normally because it's accepted that in these scenarios, a person is there without any right or title to be on the land. What that means in practice is that the notice period that normally has to be given to someone to raise court proceedings against them is reduced from normally 21 days to 48 hours. And normally the time period it takes once you get your court order to go from that point to being able to enforce the court order is reduced from, I think, typically 14 days to immediately, effectively. So what you do is you go to court, you make them aware of the circumstances, you ask for that immediate hearing, and assuming the court is willing to grant the order, you should get it that day and should be in a position to give it to sheriff officers who are able to enforce sheriff court decisions. They then take forward the actual eviction itself, so they will serve that on the person living on the property, and subsequently enforce the removal if they don't remove voluntarily.
You say go to court proceedings. How do you initiate that? Do you go through the police in the first instance? How does that process work? What's the literal starting point for that process? If you think you've got somebody living in a vehicle on your land that shouldn't be there.
The starting point would be to instruct a solicitor. In that instance, it's not a criminal matter; it's a civil matter. And whilst I don't think there's any harm in informing the police, and particularly if it's someone that you don't know that's on your land, you don't know what they're like, whether they are themselves a danger, or indeed whether they themselves are in danger. Getting in contact with the police is certainly a completely appropriate thing to do. But in terms of actually removing them, the police will tell you it's a civil matter, and so your next step would be to instruct a solicitor. It would be our job then to draft what's called an initial writ, which sets out the background to the matter and asks the court for that order to remove. It would then be your solicitor who would appear in court and ask the court to grant that order. There is nothing stopping an individual from doing that themselves, but in classic sheriff court fashion, it might not be as intuitive as it might otherwise be in terms of the drafting side of things and the progressing the court action itself to get to that point, and indeed to get to it as quickly as one can, provided that they know that there's these steps you can take to reduce the overall time periods involved to get you from person living on your land to court order to get rid of them.
So is this something that you can help with? So if people are having this trouble, should they come to you directly or should they go via the NFU Scotland helpline? How might that work if they're keen to use your services?
The NFU helpline is a free service for members, so they can contact us on that for some free advice. They can also get in touch with us to instruct us to carry the matter forward if that's what they wish to do. More than happy to help.
Thank you. The things that have really stuck with me are evidence. What we want if somebody has illegally dumped anything on your land is the removal of the item or items, and ideally the prosecution of the people concerned so that we can make steps to stop this happening again. And for that, evidence is required. And I suppose my caveat for that is just be safe while you're gathering that evidence, but get as much as you can, because somebody somewhere in the process is going to ask for it. Connor, what would be your kind of hit home message or summary of what we've talked about?
Get in contact with the police, notwithstanding that you might have reservations over whether something might or might not be done as a result of that step. And be aware that there are steps that you might be able to take yourself to mitigate against the risk of this happening in your own land, but perhaps take legal advice on that before going ahead and putting anything in place.
Thanks, Connor. Elaine?
Not to rush into doing anything prejudicial. We would not advocate confronting perpetrators. We would not advocate removing vehicles without seeking legal advice first of all and taking the correct procedures, that belt and braces approach that we've spoken about, and communication with local authority, with the police, with neighbours. It could be that your neighbours have a CCTV camera in a particular place that catches it. So again, building your case.
Great. Thank you both very much. We always put show notes with every episode, so we'll make sure that we've got details of the legal helpline in there so that people know who to contact. So thank you both very much for your time. That was really, really informative and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. So thank you again to Connor and to Elaine from Gillespie Macandrew for giving us the benefit of their knowledge and expertise there. I hope it's been helpful. As we all know, fly tipping is a blight on the landscape, so the more we can do to tackle it, the better. And thank you again to Gillespie Macandrew for their ongoing sponsorship of the On Farm podcast, which could not survive without them. So that's it from me this week. We will be back again next week, and thank you very much for listening.